As I contemplated getting up here to talk about my book, two quotations rattled around my head. First, I remember reading somewhere that Benjamin Disraeli, an author, but obviously better known, of course, as a former Prime Minister of England, once said that the author who talks about his book is as bad as the parent who cannot stop talking about his children. So am I going to be like the well-meaning father who insists you watch the endless videos of my kids' every success, I wondered. Alternatively, my other recollection comes from Theodore Zeldin, a very famous author of many books on French history, who once declared historians are no more reliable as guides to their own work than politicians are to their policies. So, am I going to be like the political hack who tries to convince you of his arguments and sell you his view of the past? Neither stance struck me as very appealing, so I plan to tread lightly. I'll try to not bore you by rehearsing in excruciating detail my book's central points, nor will I try to persuade you of its claims. Rather, I intend to speak more generally of some of the discoveries I've made and some of the insights I derive from researching and writing it. But before I get to that, a moment of confession. I'll admit that I ended up writing a much longer book than I had anticipated. As my book is so long, I'm sure I'll be forever fated to trying to summarize it. The length makes me vulnerable to Flaubert's famous aphorism. Writing history, he said, is like drinking an ocean and pissing a cupful. But he then added caustically, some historians do just the opposite. So I hope you don't think I drank a cupful to piss an ocean, but I know I risked the charge. One of the first people I met who had taught my book to her students, she had just one question. She said, "Do you have any plans to do an abridgment?" So after many years of researching and writing, it's humbling to try and distill a book and reduce it to its essentials, offer a few sound bites. I went on a talk show aired in Philadelphia. The host was a very smart African-American, and he picked out some of the juicier bits early in the book about atrocities committed by slave owners, leaving out all the other material about how slaves had creatively responded to their situation. For all the nice things he said about my book, he gave me the impression he'd never gotten past the first 100 or so pages, and I guess that's probably pretty typical. The call-in then proceeded to such questions as my stance on reparations, my stance on the Nation of Islam, and on Ebonics. Similarly, Ray Suarez, the host of Public Radio's Talk of the Nation, told me he'd read halfway through my book, and he was kind enough to say he liked what he'd managed to read. But he then channeled the next hour of talk radio, not about slavery, the ostensible topic, but about contemporary racial politics, the issue of national apologies, and the like. So apparently writing a book on slavery makes you an instant expert on modern race relations. And of course it took a fellow academic to take the lowest shots. At a conference where my book was featured, my scholarly critic harped on about the heft of my book. He employed a tool from anthropometric history, the body mass index, to see if my book was overweight. The BMI is calculated by dividing the weight of an individual, or in this case a book, in kilograms by his or its weight squared in meters. And according to tables developed by auxologists, scientists who study human growth, this scholar pronounced slave counterpoint with a BMI of 28.2, grossly overweight for an adult male book. So in short, I'm now used to my book not being read, to comments about its inordinate length and weight, and to questions that have nothing to do with the book I thought I wrote. Nothing unusual in that. Now let me turn a little more seriously to what I did discover. Well, first I wrote my book because I thought slavery was a central, fundamental, thoroughly American institution. I disagreed with those historians, and there were a number, who considered slavery an abnormality, an aberration, an alien institution fastened onto America. Essentially, everything I then discovered sort of proved my point. Nothing like knowing what you're going to say and then finding the requisite information. But most early Americans, it soon became clear, found servile labor neither embarrassing nor evil. In labor recruitment, British America was the land of the unfree, not the free. Prior to 1820, 3 times as many Africans as Europeans crossed the Atlantic to the New World. Much of the wealth of early America derived from slave-produced commodities. So slavery clearly defined the majority of American regions, not just their economies, but their societies, their political systems, their ideologies, their cultures. In large measure, conceptions of freedom were the creation of slavery. Thomas Jefferson himself once acknowledged that his slaves labored so that he could pursue his own happiness. So slavery then must be situated squarely at the center of the early American experience. Directly or indirectly, the institution touched everyone. To grapple with slavery is to penetrate to the heart of the early American experience. Second, I wanted to try and write a comprehensive history of slave life in all its dimensions, from cradle to grave, from work to play, from private to public, from the mundane details of everyday life to the symbolic forms of communal life, from bodily gestures to acts of speech. When I began, and indeed some years into the research, I wasn't sure that this goal could be achieved. But the more I researched, the more I plumbed the most arcane and intractable of sources, gradually the pieces began fitting together. But it meant ferreting information from the most unlikely of sources: archaeological digs, newspaper advertisements, the wills and inventories of slave owners, planter correspondence, governmental documents, shipping records, and the like. Almost any record of life in early America will contain information about slaves, precisely because slavery was ubiquitous and so pervasive. Since in the 17th and 18th centuries, it's very difficult to hear the authentic voice of slaves. There are very few autobiographies of ex-slaves, and only occasionally does evidence, say, of testimony in courts, cases, or governmental investigations give you a flavor of how slaves spoke, how slaves thought. So you have to write about slaves based on how they fell in between the lines, as it were, written by their masters. Only one set of actors left behind an articulated record of their thoughts in their own words. There's very little direct documentation then of African Americans' interior point of view, their private inner world. All you can do is extract scraps of data from the existing records, and the more accidentally recorded, I think, the better, and then try to piece them together into as cohesive a picture as possible. The historian's great problem, I think, is deciding what to reject and what to accept as relevant. The historian's method of research is best likened, I think, to the operation of a radar machine, the sending out of hundreds, nay thousands of probes into the material with the results flash back, followed by the never-ending search for recognizable patterns. This search for significance, for configurations, for patterns is undoubtedly a creative and imaginative process. Impressionism is often the best to which we can aspire. All history is the search for identifiable patterns, along with their anomalies, their variations, their idiosyncrasies. So I spent many years in musty archives doing the research for my book. My most picturesque archive was Ballincollig Castle in the Highlands of Scotland, where the papers of James Grant, once the governor of East Florida, was housed. I read the documents produced in bundles, all neatly tied in a dank and drafty basement. Sometimes the butler used to take pity on me and produce the odd single malt whiskey to keep up my spirits. And I found some marvelous material there. I'll just mention one nugget of gold that I mined in the Grant papers, and if you track the footnotes of my book, you'll see there are all sorts of references to the Grant papers. But by the time I was researching that collection, I knew that the task system that Dick referred to was the dominant mode of labor organization in South Carolina and Georgia. Under it, it may seem unusual. We think of slaves, we think of them working in gangs, in regimented groups, all working in unison. The task system was quite different. Under it, slaves were assigned a certain amount of work for the day, and if they were able to finish it, and certainly this varied greatly, but if they were able to finish it early, the rest of the time was their own. And we have lots of accounts of slaves finishing work 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, thereabouts. I remember thinking that under a task system, the slaves would be keen surely to work productive ground, where their labours would bear fruit quickly and efficiently. Because of course, if they could do that, the time that they would have to work on their own grounds, for which they were often given space and place, would be enlarged. So logically then, that thought had occurred to me, but I never found a document that backed up my hunch. And the historians are constantly searching for the one sort of golden document, until the Grant papers. And then I came across a letter from a planter who had moved a group of slaves from South Carolina to East Florida that had been taken over by the British in 1763, so they were beginning to develop rice in that area. And he wrote Grant, he wrote the governor of Florida, this planter, that his transplanted slaves had been quick to assess the agricultural potential of their new environment. And astonishingly, he said, and I remember my kind of jaw dropping when I read this thing, he said his slaves wrote, and I'm quoting, wrote several letters to their friends back in South Carolina. Don't ask me how they wrote those letters, because he didn't say. But in those letters, they told their friends that everything planted in the new place grew very well. And they're certain by the trial they've had that the land is good. So slaves working by the task then were especially interested in the quality of the land that they cultivated. The South Carolina Historical Society, located in a wonderful brick building designed by Robert Mills in downtown Charleston, had some of the same old world charm as Ballindoleck Castle, especially when the formidable director, a Charlestonian of the old school, would invite me into her antechamber in the late afternoons to take a glass of Madeira. I most vividly recall, and I see the convivial, not to say bibulous, moments of doing research are the ones I remember, but I remember her peering over my shoulder and bemusedly wondering how I hoped to find much about negras in the papers of the town's most respectable citizens. I should have said, and I didn't have the gall, where else should I look? But the more I researched my book, the more I realized that slaves had a past worthy of respect. A brutal regime could not crush their unquenchable human spirit. And I think one of the central messages of my book is, I hope it is anyway, is in part it's a testament to the resilience, the tenacity, the humanity of an oppressed people. Slavery did not erase all of the slaves' African heritage, although I emphasize the triumph of the slaves' humanity more than I do the survivals of an African past. I'm most impressed by the cultural creativity of enslaved Africans in the New World. At the same time, another message is that we should avoid romanticizing the slaves and not assume a solid slave community. I found a good deal of evidence of divisions among slaves, largely created by the oppressiveness of slavery, to be sure, and readily exploited by whites, but Igbos were often arrayed against Congos. Native-born or Creole slaves were often arrayed against saltwater Africans, both Creoles and Africans against Native Americans, slaves of one master against those of another, skilled slaves against field hands, and so on. So I like to think I didn't ignore the countervailing forces, the evidence of cooperation and communal solidarity among slaves, but I confronted openly the conflict among slaves, the evidence of divisiveness, the degree of antagonism, hostility, and mistrust that rent the harmony of slave quarters. Once you say slaves sustained a degree of cultural autonomy, it can seem as if you're saying that slavery as an institution was not totally repressive. That slaves were able to build lives of their own shows that slavery was not quite as bad as it theoretically could have been. Is then one implication of my demonstration that slavery often involved rewards and incentives, that there was some scope for agency by slaves, that their material treatment was not always unremittingly harsh, that I've thereby diminished the horror of slavery, shown it to be more benign than once thought? I would very strongly resist such an extrapolation. I would argue that the root of this evil of slavery was the unconstrained power over the lives of slaves exercised by individual masters. Slavery's true horror was that it involved the most extreme form of dehumanization and depersonalization known to history. The legacy of slavery that I want to convey is that slavery was horrific, not because it involved gulag-like prisons, but because it represented a gross assault on the human spirit. I don't think the assault was totally successful, but I don't think either we should minimize the psychic toll that it exerted. Another discovery of my work is what I've termed the inverse relationship between material conditions and communal autonomy under slavery. In other words, the cruel jest, the tragic quirk of fate that seems to have been at work is that the better the basic conditions of slavery, and this may seem very academic discussion to talk about conditions of slavery being better in some cases than others, but I think we can make those comparisons to some degree. But if you say that the better, the conditions of slavery in some places were better than in others, you also find that it follows that the slaves have less independence where those conditions were better. And the reverse also seems true. The worse the material conditions, actually the greater the communal independence. I say this seems like a very cruel jest, a very tragic quirk of fate. Thus, to be overworked and unhealthy, as most South Carolina slaves were, was actually to be less dependent on masters, because the Low Country was an overwhelmingly black society and slaves could avoid whites much of the time. Conversely, to have sufficient food supplies, as was the experience of most Virginia slaves, was to gain less right to hunt, to forage, and fish. Slaves in the Chesapeake not only enjoyed more material conditions in food, clothing, and housing than their Low Country counterparts, but also had to endure more intimate daily contacts with whites. So where slavery was less oppressive and race relations the more pliable, as in the Chesapeake region of Virginia and Maryland, slaves were unable to develop a fully healthy culture of their own. Where slavery was more oppressive, as in South Carolina and Georgia, the slave culture was stronger, more autonomous, and oppositional. Another aspect of my work is its recognition that slavery as an extreme form of domination resonates with the ambiguities present in all human relations. I describe the world of slavery as a world of irreconcilable contradictions. It's one of the central threads running through my book. The core contradiction of slavery, treating persons as things, accounted for much of the complexity of master-slave relations. Bought and sold like cattle, bequeathed and inherited like furniture, won and lost like lottery prizes, slaves nevertheless were flesh and blood human beings with whom relationships had to be established, negotiations arranged, accommodations reached. Masters and slaves, whites and blacks, shaped each other's destiny, determined each other's isolation, shared and molded a common culture, even as they created separate subcultures. Their fates were intricately intertwined. Slavery bound two people together in bitter antagonism while creating an organic relationship so complex and so ambivalent that neither could express the simplest human feelings without reference to the other. I describe a world that was incredibly brutal, terroristic in many ways, where whites did unimaginably savage things to blacks, and yet I also describe many instances where slaves and slave owners formed unexpectedly deep attachments. One relationship that I explore in the book is Landon Carter of Sabine Hall and his personal body servant, a slave named Nassau. Nassau was Carter's constant companion, his alter ego, almost part of his identity. Virtually a surrogate master, Nassau inspected crops, counted and branded livestock, administered the occasional lashing, but primarily acted as the plantation's chief medical aide. And the two, the master and the slave, shared a great deal. They discussed medical diagnoses. They exchanged observations on the quality of the tobacco in the fields. Carter came to know Nassau's innermost foibles and fears, that he fervently disliked snakes, for example. If Nassau's responsibilities were great, so were his frailties. He was in fact a chronic alcoholic. And there are scenes where Carter didn't just threaten Nassau, but he begged him, prayed him, told him the consequences of neglecting the care of the sick. Carter even examined his own conduct, admitting he had faults that needed to be forgiven. Yet Nassau continued to drink, in spite of Carter, even as the master dimly understood, in order to spite him. As the years passed, master and slave settled into a relationship that was part farce, part tragedy, with both sides showing deep attachment and maddening frustration. Many a time, Carter vowed never to put up with another instance of Nassau's drunkenness, and yet he always forgave and could never bear to part with him, almost exchanging blows one minute, appealing to God in forgiveness the next. Such was the tangled web of this master-slave relationship. Only Carter's death in 1778 broke this enigmatic bond. So slaves were chattels, but they insisted on their humanity. So I aim for this balanced appreciation of the oppressiveness of bondage and ability of slaves to shape their lives. This tale of Carter and Nassau raises a broader issue, the need I felt to fill my book with stories, piecing together fragments of vivid personal experience. I know my book has some tables, and there are quite a lot of arid, sterile numbers. I don't actually make any apologies, because it seems to me that numbers matter. They give a sense of magnitude and proportion. But I did want to give a sense of the personal, of slaves as human beings. Thus, let me just give you a couple of examples. When I was writing a section on population, on the proportions of blacks and whites, and it's pretty sterile, I'll admit, but I do include a few nuggets, and one of them was I described in detail a traveller out riding in the late 1770s on Long Bay, just above Georgetown in South Carolina on the coast. He's riding toward a party of slaves. It's a desolate setting, no houses or plantations around, and he describes how he fears them as a predatory band. People were often attacked and robbed on this road. He was unarmed, alone, and his horse was tired, unable to get away from them, he felt. He described himself significantly as situated as every way in their power, and resigned himself to meeting them as soon as he saw them distinctly a mile or two off. He spoke of getting off his horse, giving it a breather, so that he might attempt flight if they seemed hostile. When they drew near, he mounted and rode briskly up, and though armed with clubs, axes, and hoes, he noted, they opened right and left and let him pass peaceably. Their chief, as he described them, informing him whom they belonged to and how they were going to man a new plantation. So I wanted to give a sense of what it was like to live in a world of a black majority, how a white person might feel. And when I was writing about the patriarchal ethos, that odd blend of authority and obligation, cruelty and stewardship, which I argue is fundamental to understanding master-slave relations in the 18th century, I wanted to give it personal form. And I'll give you another example. Consider a Virginia planter's detailed instructions about his slave Aaron, how he should be treated when he returned to Virginia from England. This was a very privileged slave, a waiting man, who this planter had taken with him to England but was sending him back to Virginia. And he left a series of instructions about how this slave should be treated. He was to be used kindly, the master said. He was to live in a framed house, inherit an old bedstead formerly belonged to the master. He was to have a selection of household goods lodged securely in his house, eat meat, fat and milk, have the privilege of raising fowl, even enjoy the liberty of a horse to ride to church. But no sooner had Aaron landed in Virginia than his self-described loving master announced that if the slave ever seemed unruly, he must be tied up and slashed severely and pickled, that is, to have salt and vinegar rubbed into his wounds. If he ran away, he must wear a pothook around his neck and wear iron shackles upon his legs. So the 18th century Virginia patriarch, then, could quite naturally alternate offers of love and threats of a pickling. The patriarchal ethos was both an uplifting creed, with a master offering to protect, guard, and care for his dependents, but the underside of patriarchal protection were the sanctions, the punishments, the violence. Let me just end by putting in a plug for the importance of history and what I hope my book and many other books on slavery help do. History, it seems to me, should be studied because it's an absolutely necessary enlargement of human experience, a way of getting out of the boundaries of our own life and culture and seeing more of what human experience has been. I mean, I heard you gasp when I gave those accounts of what a loving patriarch could do. I mean, we can get a sense of how the boundaries of human life can be enlarged when we see what people could do in the past. Slavery is an evil. It is an abomination. It is an atrocity, an extreme case of man's inhumanity to man. All the more vital, then, that we come to terms with it. We cannot ignore it as something shameful, engage in denial, or allow ourselves to fall prey to amnesia. We should not prefer, in Toni Morrison's memorable words, to forget the unforgettable and to leave the unspeakable unspoken. We must come to terms with the past. It's the only way of orienting the present, of knowing where we are and where we've come from. And there are hopeful signs, I think, that many people, from ordinary folk to artists and novelists, are willing to confront slavery, whether it's by placing a plaque at the site of a sunken slave ship off Key West, celebrating slave ancestors at various plantation sites, for example at Mount Vernon. We have the director of Mount Vernon here. Building museums such as the Cincinnati's National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, which I gather is going to open in 2004. Collecting artifacts, shackles, collars, branding irons. I noticed in the collection, the Gilder Lerman collection here at the library, there's a slave shackle in the collection. But this is a practice that a growing number of African Americans are pursuing as they lay claim to America's most shameful legacy, or whether it's making films such as Glory or Amistad, or making television programs such as the PBS series on Africans in America, whether it's saving the African burial ground here in Lower Manhattan, or whether it's by writing great works of fiction like Beloved or Sacred Hunger, Barry Unsworth's fantastic book on the slave trade. We must explore the institution then in all its importance and complexity. We mustn't fantasize about the past, make up myths to justify some present purpose. We need to know as best as we can what has gone on before, our actual national experience as we navigate our present and future. Accurate historical knowledge is essential for social sanity. Pathological systems, totalitarian regimes, for example, must systematically distort history in order to survive. We need history as complete and as objective as possible. We need to study slavery thoroughly and systematically if our society is to keep its sanity, its sense of reality, its self-awareness. And if slavery can be represented fully, its story will be synonymous with that of America. Racial slavery is, after all, the grim and irrepressible theme governing the settlement of much of the Western Hemisphere. Many claims have been made for the single key to understanding America, the one bedrock on which all else rests. Is it the frontier? Is it the desire for personal freedom? Is it economic abundance? Is it land speculation? Just to name many that historians have said that it remains the bedrock of what America is about. But there's little dispute about what is America's nightmare, its dark underside. Racial slavery is early America's haunting original sin, its heart of darkness. America provided unprecedented opportunities for some, predicated on the unprecedented exploitation of others. Liberation and exploitation were the reverse sides of the same coin. They were inextricably joined at the hip. Thus, any full accounting of early American history must reckon with the dramatic expansion of both bondage and liberty, the entrenchment of Southern slavery, the fundamental impact of the Haitian Revolution, the development of Northern racism. Slavery was omnipresent in early America, and African Americans should be neither invisible nor peripheral, but essential, crucial, central players in the early American drama. Thank you. But he then added caustically, some historians do just the opposite. So I hope you don't think I drank a cupful to piss an ocean, but I know I risked the charge. One of the first people I met who had taught my book to her students, she had just one question. She said, "Do you have any plans to do an abridgment?" So after many years of researching and writing, it's humbling to try and central points, nor I try to persuade you of its claims. Rather, I intend to speak more generally of some of the discoveries I've made and some of the insights I derive from researching and writing it. But before I get to that, a moment of confession. I'll admit that I ended up writing a much longer book than I had anticipated. As my book is so long, I'm sure I'll be forever fated to trying to summarize it. The length makes me vulnerable to Flaubert's famous aphorism. Writing history, he said, is like drinking an ocean and pissing a cupful. Distill a book and reduce it to its essentials, offer a few sound bites. I went on a talk show aired in Philadelphia. The host was a very smart African American, and he picked out some of the juicier bits early in the book about atrocities committed by slave owners, leaving out all the other material about how slaves had creatively responded to their situation. For all the nice things he said about my book, he gave me the impression he'd never gotten past the first 100 or so pages, and I guess that's probably pretty typical. The call-in then proceeded to such questions as my stance on reparations, my stance on the Nation of Islam. As I contemplated getting up here to talk about my book, two quotations rattled around my head. First, I remember reading somewhere that Benjamin Disraeli, an author, but obviously better known, of course, as a former Prime Minister of England, once said that the author who talks about his book is as bad as the parent who cannot stop talking about his children. So am I going to be like the well-meaning father who insists you watch the endless videos of my kids' every success, I wondered. Alternatively, my other recollection comes from Theodore Zeldin, a very famous author of many books on French history, who once declared, "Historians are no more reliable as guides to their own work than politicians are to their policies." So, am I going to be like the political hack who tries to convince you of his arguments and sell you his view of the past? Neither stance struck me as very appealing, so I plan to tread lightly. I'll try to not bore you by rehearsing in excruciating detail my book's